Okay, welcome back to Sam's Mini Workshop, where today we are going to continue along with our tutorial on painting Castellan Crowe. We are almost done. We only have a few sections left to complete here. So today, for the purpose of this video, we are going to work on painting the helmet. We are going to choose to use the helmet portion instead of the head. And then we are also going to focus on painting his sword here. So let's hop right in. Okay, we're going to start off today's video by focusing on his helmet. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint that kind of like nice white color that shows on the box. However, because it's base coated in black, I don't really want to jump straight to the white because it's going to give me a ton of layers that need to be put on to get it covered. So we're going to go kind of halfway in between, much like we did with the white pauldron. And we're going to give it a quick base coat of some carcharodon gray or administratum gray, basically any light gray. And this doesn't need to be super well covered or opaque or anything like that, but just to give it something kind of in between the black and the white, kind of help us get that white on there without having to do like quite so many coats with it. All right. So just keep your paint thin and go over it, give it a coat or two with this gray, and then we will move on and we will work on getting that white put on there. So here we have the helmet with that carcharodon gray on there. And it doesn't need to be fully opaque, just something to give us a nice base coat or undercoat for that. So now we're going to move on to our white itself, which I'm going to use Trooper White. It's from Two Thin Coats. This would be, I believe it's Corax White if you wanted to use Citadel paints. And we're just going to go in. We're going to get everything base coated and, in that nice white color. Keep your paint thin and keep your brush moving. Try not to go over any areas that you had previously painted on, because then you risk tearing the paint there. If you do happen to do that, just make sure to kind of take a step back, give it a bunch of time to dry, and once it's fully dry, you can go back in and get that area covered back up again. You're going to need several coats for this, for sure. So just take your time with it and be patient. And then when you're done, you should be left with a nice, smooth base coat of white. Okay, so here we have our helmet with that white on there. And I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see against the white background. But it took me about 5 coats to get that fully opaque. So now we're going to go in and we're going to get the shading lined in. And I'm going to do that with some rodent gray. I believe this is also Skaven Blight Dinge if you're using Citadel paints. And so what I did is I got it thinned down really heavily until it's like almost a wash. I'm using a real small brush here. And basically our goal is we're just going to go in and we're going to drop some of this into all of the recessed areas of the armor. Okay, there we have all of our shading laid in. And I did make sure to go back in and kind of readjust some of the areas where I'd perhaps not been as neat as I could have been. But it's looking pretty good now. So now we're going to move on to highlighting. And that we're just going to go straight for a pure white. Just one level of highlight here. All right, so I'm going to use some AK white. Again, I've got a pretty small brush going on. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to go in and we're going to do just like a standard edge highlight. Nothing fancy, no multiple highlights here because there's not really a lot of room to move in terms of tones between off-white and white. So just go in with your white, use the side of the brush where you can, and you're just going to pick out those edges. And get a nice clean edge highlight going. All right, here we have our highlighted helmet. And it's very subtle. It's actually very hard to see on the camera, but in real life, it is a little bit easier to see those highlights on there. But what I am going to do now, just for the sake of time, is I'm going to go in and I'm going to block in some of those areas that use colors and things that we've already colored in other videos. So I'm going to do the metallics and things like that. And then when I come back, we'll do the last couple elements, which will be these cables coming out of the side of the head here, and then we'll do the lenses. So here is our helmet so far. Got a lot of those nice details on there, blocked out. So next, I want to go in and I want to try to work on some of these cables that are sitting across the side of his head here. And if we look at the box art, there's actually two different cables on there. The top one, I don't know if you can see that there. The top one is going to be kind of like a yellow hazard strip. And the bottom one is going to be red. So we're going to go in and we're going to do our best to do that. And we're going to start with that hazard strip one. In order to do that, I'm going to start with a base coat of Averland Sunset, just to kind of get like a nice base coat to work from. It covers better than a lot of the other yellows do. So it will help kind of transition that black over towards yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to real carefully with a small brush go in, and you may need to turn the model in order to get comfortable with it. And we're going to just block that top cable in with the yellow, using as many coats as we need to in order to get it fully yellow. The reason I'm starting with the yellow cable as opposed to, say, the red one is because it's going to take more work, more steps for us to do the hazard cable, which means more chance for something to go wrong, something to get smudged, whatever it might be. And so if we can do that one first, the red one will be far more straightforward for us, and we'll have less chance of like messing up our other cable. Okay, so there we have our cable blocked in with that Averland Sunset. So now we're going to go on and we're going to go a little bit brighter with that yellow. I'm going to use Skulker Yellow from two thin coats. If you were using Citadel, I believe it's Uriel Yellow. So I'm going to get that just a little bit thinned down on the palette here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over this cable with a bunch of thin coats until I get that nice kind of bright yellow established. And then we can move on from there. One more step with our yellow here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a slightly brighter yellow, yellow flare, or I think Flash gets yellow. You're using Citadel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this and I'm going to work it kind of just as a highlight up along kind of the more prominent upward edge of the cable here, just to give it a little bit more of a highlight. And this is totally optional. You definitely don't have to do this if you don't want. But I'm just going to go over that a couple of times with some kind of thin coats, just to give it a little bit more punch, I guess you could say. Help it stand out just that little bit more. And so then what we'll do is we'll move on to getting the hazard stripe actually painted in there. And so for this, we're just going to need some black. Any black of your choosing will do just fine. Just get it thinned down on your palette and under control. I'm going to use a pretty small brush because it is a pretty small cable. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to come in and we're going to, at kind of an angle here, we're going to just etch in a few lines. And it's okay if they're, kind of thin and not super defined at first. The goal right now is just to get them locked in. We can always go back and, darken them, thicken them up later. We just want to get the spacing right to begin with. So as you're doing it, do your best to keep the spacing as even as possible between them. Again, knowing that, of course, we can always come back in and correct a little bit using whichever particular color we would need when we're done. Alright, so I'm going to keep working with that, and then we'll come back and we'll have a look. Okay, so here's our cable. Finished to the best I could there. And so we're going to go one more step, and this is completely optional, but it's just going to be a little bit of a highlight across the whole thing. And because we got two different colors, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take kind of a neutral highlight. So I'm going to use Skeleton Legion, which would be a Shabty bone, kind of like a lighter bone color. And I'm going to thin it down super heavily so it's like a glaze. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get most of it off my brush. And I'm just going to, in a few coats, just glaze up across the whole section where that light would be catching, just to give it one whole consistent highlight that should hopefully kind of tie the whole area together. So wait for that first one to dry, and then we're going to go back over it again. And so just keep doing this for however many coats you feel like you need until you're satisfied with it. And now it will be time for our red cable. So we're going to base coat that to start with some Mephiston red, and then we're going to work up through a few highlights with it. We're going to use some Evil Sunz Scarlet kind of across the whole cable, some Wild Rider red focused up towards the top, and then finally just a little bit of Troll Slayer orange right up at the very top of the cable. But we are going to start with that Mephiston red, nice and thin down on the palette. And we're just going to very carefully go in and block in that red cable. Trying our best not to get any onto that yellow cable that we've already done. And then when we're all done with all of it, what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll put a little bit of a shade line in between the two cables there to kind of define where one ends and the other begins. Okay, so we've got our red cable going there. So now we're going to go in and we're just going to get ourselves a few of these highlights put on there. So starting with a little bit of Evil Sunz Scarlet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm just going to really gently run up the length of the red cable we have there. Just starting towards the bottom, focusing on the upward edge, just real gently running that up to the peak. Okay, and when we're happy with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little bit of the Wild Rider red and focus this up towards the tip here, starting maybe in kind of the upper half of the red cable, and just running that highlight up to the top. Kind of like that. And then we'll take just a little bit of the Troll Slayer orange. Again, same thing. Just up towards the very, very top. There we go. That's essentially what we're looking for there. It's pretty subtle. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of corn red and black, and I'm going to mix them together and run them between the two cables to be able to kind of get a little bit more definition there. Okay, so with that corn red and black, what we're looking to do here is just kind of find the split between the two cables. Gently run it in down the length. This will help kind of differentiate and provide a little bit of shadow that will show where one cable ends and the other begins. if you want, you can take a little bit of this same color and put it up around top of the cable where it meets the housing of the helmet to again add a little definition there too. We can do the same thing with the yellow cable, but this time using just a little bit of Scrag Brown. So if you want to do that, feel free to do so up by the top of that cable in order to just add a little bit more definition there. Okay, so now that our cables are done, we're going to begin to move in and work on our eye lenses here. And I'm going to go with a blue eye lens, and I also want him to kind of glow a little bit. I want to try to simulate the fact that he's got some psychic, he's using his psychic abilities, and he's got some of that warp light coming out through the lenses of his helmet there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by base coating the whole inside of the eye lens with a dark blue. So some Abyss blue, I think that's Cantor blue and Citadel. And what we're going to do is we're going to just come in and we're going to get this all into the eye lens there, including all of the recesses. So we're just going to work that in, being as gentle as careful as we can. If you do make any mistakes, that's perfectly fine. We'll just go in and correct with some of that white when we're all done at the end. We're just going to gently work that into all of the areas of the eye lens. And once we've got that in there, then we'll move on to kind of our next step. Okay, so there's our blue, deep blue in the eye lenses. Now to start to get a little bit of that glowing effect going, what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin down some of that Abyss blue that we were using, and I'm going to really thinly glaze it on just underneath the lens here. And I'm going to want to go really, really thin with it because it is going to show up really, a lot easier on white than it would if we were painting this over a darker color. So just go ahead and kind of glaze this upwards towards the lens and build it up until you're happy with the effect. And it should be fairly subtle because we are going to go in and add some more colors to it as we go along. Next up, we are going to take some of our next color, which will be some Sentient Turquoise. I believe this is also Thousand Suns blue. And I'm going to focus this more towards just the center of the lens here. I apologize. I'm going to do the best I can to film this, but it's a little hard to kind of get this, where it needs to be. To see it. So just run a little bit of that into the center of the lens, leaving the darker blue on the edges. And then we're going to do the same thing of where we're going to thin it down really good, and we're going to glaze it down below the lens. But again, also taking care to ensure that, one, the glaze is very thin, and also we want to begin to focus it even more towards the center of the lens. So we don't want to go quite as far out with it as we were previously. And we will move on to our next blue, which for this case will be some Cursed blue. I believe this is also Ahriman blue from Citadel. And again, we're going into the lens, but just even more focused towards the center. So that we're building up the intensity that blue towards the middle of the lens. then just like before, I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to really thin some of this down. We're going to use just a little bit of it to glaze even more towards the center of our lens. A brighter color going. And then we'll go just a step further with our blue. We're going to use a little bit of Ray Gun Glow, or Bharat Blue, I believe is the other equivalent. And again, even more towards the center of the lens here. And the same thing with the glaze. And focusing it really tightly towards the center of our lens here. Next, I'm going to take just a little bit of white, and we are going to add it into our previous Ray Gun Glow, which will give us a nice, really kind of bright teal color is what we're going for here. I want a good bit of white in there. I kind of want it almost white with just a little tint of the Ray Gun Glow. And this is going to be for the center of our lens. It will really give the impression that that lens is glowing. And then I'm going to take just a little bit of white on its very own and put just the smallest bit in the very, very center of the lens, almost a dot, where the light, in theory, would be the most intense. All right, there is our finished helmet with that glow applied. I did have to play around a decent bit with it to try to get some of those areas like smoothed out a little bit, but I do think I'm fairly happy with how it turned out in the end. I might play around with it a little bit more, but for now I'm okay with it. So with the helmet done, we can now move on to the last piece of the model outside of the base, which will be his sword. Okay, so now we're going to move on to painting his sword here. And what I'm going to do first is basically get the whole thing base coated with a mix, a really dark purple. So I've taken some Nagaroth Night and a little bit of Death Reaper. I think this is, I can't remember what this is in Citadel, but I'll look it up and I'll have it in the text on the video for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a 50-50 mix. So I got basically a super, super dark purple. And then I'm just going to base coat this all over the sword, all of the flames, basically every bit of it other than like the hilt and the little eye there in the center. Okay, now that we've got that base coated on there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start basically working in through some lighter and lighter purples as we work our way through some highlighting areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that Nagaroth Night on its own, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin it down so it's a little bit translucent, and I'm going to start kind of very, using kind of like a chunky highlight essentially over a lot of these like raised up areas of the flame that's coming off the sword. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to focus it so that the purple is going to be getting stronger towards the blade of the sword, and then it gets more and more towards that dark, almost like gray or grayish purple that we put on as it moves towards the edges of the flames. So I'm just going to kind of go in and layer that over all of these kind of like raised up areas concentrating it more and more towards the blade of the sword, while working on keeping some of that that darker color in the further recessed areas. The other thing I'm going to do with it is I'm going to create my first kind of chunky, very chunky highlight along the edge of the blade here. So we'll just kind of run that along in like a nice, real thick line towards the edge of the blade. Okay, and because it's so dark, it should kind of naturally just blend itself into the previous layer that we had on there. So I'll go around and finish that, and then we'll come back and we'll start adding some lighter purples to it. All right, so it's pretty subtle, but we've got a little bit more of a purple tone building up here. So I'm going to jump up a little bit further in the purple. It's a little bit of this Xeris, not really sure how to pronounce that. Purple, lighter purple. And this one, we're going to treat pretty much the same way as we did the previous step, but we're going to focus it even more just up towards the raised areas of the smoke here. Smoke, flame, whatever you want to call it, that's coming off of his blade. And again, working towards leaving even more of that like darkened purple into the recesses there. So we're going to work around on that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this purple and we're going to do another edge highlight, thinner within the one that we previously had, along the edge of our blade here. So just run that on there. I'm still keeping this one a little thicker because we're going to do one more very fine one after this. All right, but try to keep it within that last highlight that you did. There we got that extra purple on there. And we're going to take just a quick pause before moving on to our next highlight. And what we're going to do is we're going to go in and fill in some of those recessed areas with that kind of pink burgundy colored glow that you can see on the box art. And I'm going to start out by using some sword hilt burgundy for that. Citadel, I believe that's Screamer pink. So I'm going to get some of that thinned down and kind of ready on the palette. And what I'm looking to do with this is run it into some of these the recessed areas. So for instance, like inside the eye, on the skulls, get that in there. Some other areas would be, some of these recesses in the flames themselves. If you look on the box art, they have a lot of this color kind of built up inside those recessed areas. So we're going to apply a little of the sword hilt burgundy into there to start kind of building up some of this color before taking it a little bit brighter. One last place to be aware of is we're going to want to go in and begin running this color inside all of these runes that are on the blade. Almost kind of like we're doing a reverse highlight. All right, next up we're going to try to brighten up that burgundy pink area a little bit more. We're going to do this. I'm going to take some glistening gums, which I believe is Pink Horror for Citadel paints. And we're going to thin it down again, pretty much the same way we had before. So it's nice and thin, not like a glaze, but a little bit translucent. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint that in, focusing more towards the center of the recessed areas that we had. So I would maybe take it and build it in kind of towards the center of this spot here, as opposed to having it be through the whole area. So, the eyes maybe come in, dot it more towards the center so that the color is brighter towards the middle. That'll focus there like that. So we're going to work through all of this area, adding in this slightly more intense color to all of the recessed areas that we had previously kind of outlined with that sword hilt burgundy. And then we'll come back and we'll go another step with it. And here we have all that pink applied in there. See, it's starting to build up a nice bit of contrast. We're going to go a step further with this, and we're going to take a little bit of a light bone color. So I got Vampire Fang here, but Screaming Skull would work just as well for this. And we're going to mix it into that previous pink that we were using, get kind of like a 50-50 mix going on. And what we're then going to do with that, we're going to go in and apply that even further into the recessed areas. So looking for the deepest parts, and we're just going to run some of that in there again to try to intensify that effect even more. So in the eyes, I'm going to feed it into the center. In the recess pits, just kind of build it up or dot it into those deeper parts there. And then we're going to run it into the runes as well. And the runes, we're going to not go... What we're going to do with it is we're going to try to focus it away from some of the corners as much as we can. Look more towards the center of those runes with that. All right, and lastly, for this portion of the sword, we're going to take that light bone color on its own. And what we're going to do with that is just come in and dot it into the very deepest parts of the recesses. Okay? Just to give it kind of a focal point. So we're going to come in and we're just going to kind of dot that in there. We would come in and do the same thing with the eyes, just kind of down into the center as much as we can. For the runes, if you want to do some dotting in there, just kind of focus it towards the areas where like multiple lines come together to give it a little bit of extra focus. And when you're done with that too, if you're looking at it and you feel as though any of your transitions between those pinks and the purples or anything like that could use a little softening, that's totally okay. Just take one of the darker colors, so like that dark base coat that we used to begin with, or even the dark burgundy, and thin it down to a glaze and just kind of use it to knock back some of those colors until they blend together a little bit more. All right, there the flame effect is, and it's looking pretty good. So we're going to go back to highlighting the purple now, and with that we're going to use some Slaanesh Gray. And we're basically going to go in, and this is going to be an edge highlight over, well, like all the sharp edges. So for instance, the sword, I might take the tip of the paintbrush here. Sorry if I can get that to focus. There it goes. Just kind of run it along the edge of the blade. Pick up that highlight there. Oops, not like that. I'll have to go back and fix that. It was a little thicker than I wanted it to be. Essentially, you could go in along the edge of the blade, use the tip of the side of the brush, and just kind of run it up along there to get a nice thin highlight. Other things we're going to do is we're going to go into the flames themselves and focus on some of those raised details. So, for instance, on our skull here, picking out the facial features on the skull itself. As well as some of the more, kind of prominent areas of the smoke there. Okay, so next up we're going to take a very light gray. So I'm going to use Carcharodon gray, but you could use Administratum or whatever other light gray you wanted to use. Thin it down just a little bit to get it under control. And then this is going to be mostly used just as an accent highlight, right? So we're going to be looking for things like this little edge of the sword here, and we're going to want to just kind of bring it out towards the point, the tip of it. To kind of draw extra attention out to that. Same thing with like this little spot here. Some other spots we want to do, look for some of these like kind of really prominent bumps or ridges, and we're just going to kind of put a little dot on there inside of the previous highlight that we'd put out. Again, just to kind of highlight some of the most prominent spots, maybe a little towards the edge of some of these smoke trails. Draw a little extra attention out to it. Alright. The other thing I'm going to do with it is just kind of go along the center line of the blade here, and I'm going to add it onto that center line, kind of running all the way down. The reason I want to do this is because with so many of the runes being highlighted in the, kind of all around the edges in that same color that, the initial edge highlight was done in, I feel like that kind of center line of the sword can get a little lost in there. So by going in and putting a little bit of this lighter gray on it, it will help kind of get that spot to stand out just a little bit more. And then up at the front of the sword, you can take it, kind of work it up the edge towards the tip of the blade. Okay, last but certainly not least, we're going to take just a little bit of pure white and dot it just into some of the super most prominent areas that we want to highlight. So, for instance, take like a small dot and get it just on the end of there, just on the end of there. A couple of these really, really prominent spots on the smoke. Drop a little bit into there. And then one final place that we want to get a little bit of white is just towards the tip of the sword. So what I'm going to do is just kind of with the edge of the brush, work this along the edge just on that last little bit leading up to the tip. Okay. And we're all done with that white. Then the blade of the sword is pretty much done, which means we can then move on to the areas down here around the hilt. Here we're looking at our nice, almost completed sword here. For the sake of time, I did go ahead and fill in the gold as well as kind of the black details on the hilt there. I do cover that in some previous videos, so if you want to see how we did that, you can go back and check one of those out. But now we're going to take care of basically the last detail we have, which is these little kind of demonic eyes that appear in the center of the cross piece of the sword, and it is on both sides. So to start with, I'm going to go back to that 50-50 mix of the black and Nagaroth Night, or Nagaroth Night, however you pronounce it, that we used to base coat the sword here. And the reason I want to do that is I want to make sure that I get that kind of covered all over here and fed down into the recesses. And I just figured it would be easier to do it like this and then apply our lighter purple over kind of the raised area than it would be to paint the whole thing in the lighter purple and then have to try to go back in and feed this darker color into those little recessed areas later. Right, so once we have that kind of nice deep base coat in there and covering all those recesses, what I want to do is apply a lighter purple to the gem itself, to all the raised area. And for this, I took a little bit of our Xeris purple and I added in some white to it to create a brighter color. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that and I'm going to paint it in all over that center kind of like raised area of the gem there, so that it covers and it's nice and bright, because what I want is for this to stand out pretty well on there. And also we're going to have to paint kind of a little slit for the eye on there. And so if it's too dark, that will not stand out. So I'm going to go over that with a couple of coats, and then we'll come back and we'll move on to the next step. Next step here is what we're going to do is we're going to take a light gray. So I'm going to use some Carcharodon gray, or if you wanted to use Administratum gray, that'll work as well. And we're going to put an edge highlight around the outside of that eye there. I'm going to do my best to film some of this, but it's a very small detail that kind of appears at a pretty odd angle. So I apologize if it doesn't show up well. Something like that, working around the outside of the gem there. Okay, and finally our last step is to create the slit that's going to actually make it an eye. So I'm going to take a little bit of pure black for that. And what we're going to do is we're just going to draw a little line down the center of the gem portion there. Kind of right in the middle as much as we can. Something kind of like that. And you can refine it as you need to from there. And with that, our sword is basically done. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble the rest of the model outside of the base, and then we will have a look at the work we've done. Okay, so here we have our finished, or almost finished, Castellan Crowe model. If you've been following along in this series, I really want to thank you for your support and for following along this whole time. If this is the first video that you've watched, I want to thank you for checking out this video and supporting the channel. And please, feel free to hop back and take a look at any of the other ones we have on here about how to paint Castellan Crowe. We'll have one more part in this series in which we will cover going over this base at the bottom, and we'll get that all squared away. And after that, he will be all done. He'll be ready to march out and face off against the forces of chaos in the name of the God Emperor. So once again, thank you so much for your time, for your support. Please feel free to check out my Instagram as well, at Sam's Mini Workshop, where I post tons more Warhammer content, short tutorials, other things of that nature. And until next time, I hope you have some fun painting.